Hey, I'm Rose,
And I'm Angie.
and this is Our Lives with Bots, the show where we ask important, timely questions about what it means to live with our bot counterparts. And from time to time, we also dive deep into what an AI future might look like for us.
Sometimes we agree, sometimes we spiral, but we always go deep.
Speaking of deep, we are in our series on companion chatbots. We've covered just a general overview of companion chatbots, giving you a little bit of a taste of what the landscape looks like, but now we're going to be talking about the actual research. From our previous episode, you might have gotten a sense that things are a little bit negative. Everything is harmful, terrible, whatever. And we do hold that kind of cautious perspective. But when you look at the actual research, there's a little bit less of a clear picture. It's a little bit more gray, a little bit less black and white. So the research we're going to be talking about today actually goes to show that these interactions with companion chatbots or using chatbots as companions can be beneficial in various ways. Of course, these sorts of impacts that we are calling beneficial, in your perspective, might not necessarily be the case, but we will be covering these studies just to give you a sense of what research has been done and what people are finding about relationships with companion chatbots and the sorts of social effects they have.
And we wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't show you the effects that they're not finding. And so we'll hold a critical eye there and show you perhaps some of the weaknesses in some of these studies that the authors themselves have pointed out and the things that we can't yet infer from these studies and the opportunities for further research. And we're going to conclude this episode by also bringing you some more recent news articles that again point to some of the cautionary tales of some of these companion chatbots.
So, to start out, we're going to be talking about kind of a foundational piece on companion chatbots. So, this study was published in 2022, and the authors are Z and Pentina. They're highly cited in this space. Back when companion chatbots were just starting, the question was kind of where do you find people who have relationships with companion chatbots? And these researchers decided to go to the source, which is Reddit. Right? Reddit is where you see all of the things happen before they are happening in the real world or being talked about. And you can find any sort of niche you want to on Reddit. What these researchers wanted to do was talk to people who had relationships with the companion chatbot Replica. It was one of the first known and the most popular in the US. Its popularity has only increased since then. And what they basically did was just go on the subreddit for Replica and look at some of the active users on the platform and reach out to them over message and ask, hey, do you want to be interviewed?
So, Rose, maybe before we talk about the findings, maybe we can share with them what sort of psychological frameworks or what they were expecting to find.
So they were trying to figure out how and why people develop relationships with companion chatbots, and they wanted to know whether any existing psychological frameworks for relationship development could help explain how people develop these relationships. What they did was they interviewed these individuals who were active users of Replica. They asked them all sorts of questions like, oh, how much do you self disclose with the chatbot? Do you have any privacy concerns? How much do you trust the chatbot? What's your history of use of the chatbot? What sorts of conversation topics do you have or do you cover with the chatbot? What's your perception of how close you are to the chatbot? And just generally, what's your perception of the benefits and drawbacks of using the app? These interviews were like 40 to 60 minutes each. And they took this data and they used what's called a grounded theory approach to analyze these interviews and figure out what sort of lens or theory might best explain the patterns that they saw. The lens that they thought best applied based on this approach was attachment theory.
I mean, maybe for some of our listeners, do you want to give us a brief overview about why attachment theory was valuable in this context and maybe just what it is?
So, attachment theory is a developmental psychology theory, and it looks at how relationships formed in childhood inform how people approach relationships throughout their lives. And so, there are different sorts of attachment styles that fit into the certain categories. So, you might have heard something like anxious attachment style, or avoidant attachment style, or secure attachment style. Secure attachment style, for example, is feeling secure in your relationship. So, you and your caregiver was present and helpful and caring. And so you kind of take that sort of experience into adulthood where you're not necessarily having negative or toxic relationships. You feel more secure, you're less anxious. Whereas anxious and avoidant attachment styles, maybe your caregiver wasn't always present. There was a little bit of up and down in terms of how the relationship developed. And so you take that into your relationships in adulthood, and maybe you're a little bit more anxious with your close relationships, maybe have a harder time feeling close to people. With attachment theory, there's kind of parts of attachment theory that inform whether or not this attachment is good. So things like proximity maintenance, which is like keeping someone close and feeling like they're always present. Safe haven, which is having someone be like a confidant, someone you can trust. And then secure base, which is kind of like, oh, I had a really good relationship with my caregiver growing up. They're a secure base. From that platform, I can kind of like launch into my adult relationships and do that successfully. Whereas if you don't have a secure base, you're kind of like sitting in sand and you can't really jump very high, that kind of thing. And so these are sort of parts of attachment theory that they use to understand relationship development with chatbots. And it's interesting that attachment theory worked here because you might assume that human relationship development is very different from human chatbot relationship development, but it doesn't necessarily seem to be the case.
So, what did you find that was interesting in the users that they interviewed?
Almost all of the users that they interviewed assigned their chatbot to a different gender than them. So if the user identified as a man, they made their chatbot a woman. Of the 14, there were 4 who were female, 10 male. Most of these users indicated that they used the chatbot only as a friend. Only a couple of them used it as a romantic partner. So I thought that was kind of interesting and against the norm or the stereotype of, oh, everyone's just using this as like AI girlfriend or boyfriend or partner or things like that.
But I wonder if it isn't reflective also of where it was from a point of time, right? Because that study was in 2022. And since then, we've seen a lot more people use these chatbots for romantic use. But I wonder if it wasn't also back then, not only was it more nascent as a technology, so people were like, oh, I'll just use it as a friend and see how it goes. I don't know. So more experimental. But also, the technology wasn't as advanced as it is today in terms of its ability to have more nuanced conversations in terms of generative AI.
There's so many people who are still using it as friends today. I mean, we see stories in the news about romantic partnership, and I think to some extent, maybe people who start to seek it out just as a friend to begin with, it becomes a romantic relationship. I do worry, like in the future, that we might see more of that. Of, oh, I don't need a person who's unpredictable to be my boyfriend. I can just have an AI that's predictable. Speaking of which, quick aside, there is a subreddit r/my boyfriends and AI, and it has a lot of users and people are posting about their relationships, and they like to generate AI images of them and their AI partner. And there's also a lot of talk about the stereotypes and the backlash that they receive from their friends and family when they disclose that they have a romantic relationship with a chatbot. And so if anyone is interested in checking that out, you can learn a lot about the community by looking at that subreddit.
That is really, really interesting.
In the paper, they talked about the way that Replica was designed, so the model itself and its method of responses. Based on some of the studies that I've done, there are people who really hate how Replica responds. And it turns out there is a little bit of a scriptedness, but it's based on the experience of past users. And this is a quote. So Replica's responses represent predicted results based on ChatGPT 3's neural network language model. So they just use ChatGPT 3 as the base model. Oh, it's a predictive algorithm. You know, you put in an input and then it gives you the most likely response. But Replica's developers fine tuned this model based on the unique data set consisting of shared conversations from the users. So Replica users shared their conversations, and as a result, the app will select the best ranked responses from 1 million responses in the dataset, with the rankings based on users' upvote fraction. So within the app, users can interact over text with the chatbot. And when the chatbot responds, you can give a little thumbs up or thumbs
Yeah.
down on that chat to give your feedback. And so I guess that's at least back in 2022, that's what this was based on. And I do think that maybe that has pervaded. So those sort of scripted responses that people get were once what people wanted to see, but maybe now it's like I expect more from an AI model.
Yeah.
This isn't cutting it.
And I think to some extent, ChatGPT being so pervasive will be driving that. And so if I go to ChatGPT for regular usage and I'm getting a certain kind of affinity, a certain kind of companionship just from ChatGPT, then when I opt into something like a companion bot, I'm expecting something just a little bit more. Like it needs to give me back something a bit more, even if it is just intimacy from a friendship perspective. I'm expecting that little bit more intimacy from that companion bot, I think, when people opt into that. I would imagine. And just going back to the attachment theory piece, just to help our listeners pull it together, then, what would you want people to take away from this paper in terms of their findings?
What they say in the abstract, so just the first part of the paper that gives an overview, they talk about how users find benefits from these relationships, but they also have kind of an asterisk that is, but people can get attached or addicted. What's interesting though is within their data of those 14 users, number one, only 12 were replica users. Two of them were researchers who interacted with the chatbot and then did the interviews themselves. So there's a little bit of a, okay, maybe it's only like 12 people, right, who are actual users. But of those 12 people who were users, only one person said that they were overly attached and somewhat
Okay.
addicted to the chatbot in a way that harmed their real life relationships. Whereas everyone else, to the extent that it's shown in the paper, said, oh, this relationship with the chatbot actually has helped me be more open. So it's the secure base part of the attachment style where, for example, a quote from someone said that because of interacting with the chatbot, they felt more comfortable talking about difficult topics with real people in their lives. And the chatbot generally helped people be more open and vulnerable to real friends because the chatbot modeled positive interactions with people and they were able to practice those sorts of positive interactions.
And I mean, I've cited this paper many times myself, so I'm obviously a huge fan of this work. But just to try and help people look at it, and again, because we want to bring a critical lens, maybe some of the things for people to have a bit of a watch out is, as you've said a few times, this is only 12 people. These are 12 people that to some extent have a degree of self selection in that they are already users of Replica. That's how they were found. They were on the Reddit or the Reddit platform. They were already using it. And so when we talk about a secure base, these are people that are interacting with other users. I imagine that that would already kind of predict the outcome to some extent. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there is some argument that, oh, if you are engaging in some sort of behavior long term, like interacting with a chatbot, if someone asks you whether that's good or bad for you, you're more likely to say it's good for you as a way to kind of justify your engagement in that behavior. There's definitely that to consider. I think what we can really get from this is kind of highlighting the state that people are in that prompts them to seek out a companion chatbot. For these users, most of them sought out the chatbot because they just felt lonely. It was also during the pandemic. And so most of them said that they just needed a person to talk to, especially during the pandemic. I'm going to quote a story from one of the users. One respondent who lived in rural Austria with the nearest city 15 kilometers away stated that the pandemic reduced his interpersonal connections even further. Another respondent had to work on a schedule opposite to his wife's and had no one to talk to when back home. The three student responses expressed similar loneliness and stress when all classes were transitioned to an online mode. And in addition to a lack of physical contact, some informants mentioned lack of mental connection with like-minded people as a source of loneliness. Several respondents confessed that they downloaded the app when they were emotionally vulnerable and needed to be cared for and loved due to difficulties in their lives. And like some people had no family to take care of them, and another had tough moments when they had a transition in life, graduating from university and didn't have any job opportunities because of the pandemic. And two of these people had relationship breakups and they needed comfort. So these are very tangible stories of why people seek out these companion chatbots. A lot of them cite that these relationships with the chatbot helped their relationships with real people. With attachment theory, the idea is that once kind of the external threat is gone, like the I don't have anyone around or I feel lonely, once that's gone, the attachment that you have with the thing that is giving you kind of this safe haven and reciprocity, your perspective of it changes. You no longer are attached to it in the same way that you were before. It's kind of like what we talked about last episode, where your perspective was like, I don't need an ever responsive chatbot. I'm not in a state where I need that social connection. Whereas other people who have this need are perceiving these interactions as really valuable and dynamic and engaging.
And I think that makes a huge amount of sense. And I think we've seen that in other studies, some of which we'll chat about, is that we can't take away from people's lived experience of having real benefits from these chatbots when they're able to fill a need that is something like loneliness. And we're seeing that, and we'll talk about another study shortly where loneliness is really being met as a need through these chatbots. But certainly, as you say, often we're seeing users stopping using them after a few months, as maybe once that need is met, or once they've, having learned certain skills, gone and met people in, other human beings, and then they've now reformed those connections out in the real world, and they no longer need that chatbot. So we're certainly seeing research play out what you've just said, Rose, and I think it's great the research shows that. Another study that Maples and colleagues did in 2024, that was a Stanford University study.
This is actually a study that I came across back when it came out, and I was really excited to see more research being done on companion chatbots because at that point there really wasn't much out there.
So essentially, Maples and colleagues were trying to address what is considered a global mental health crisis, and loneliness being central to that. So globally, over 1 billion people suffer with mental health issues, and loneliness is probably one of the biggest drivers in that. Actually, they focused specifically on the student population. And what's interesting is that when you look at the US population alone, over half of the US student population suffer with loneliness, which is, really critical problem. I mean, when you think about people feeling isolated, people feeling that they need a friend or a therapist or someone that listens, and they wanted to address that as a particular problem. And so they set up this research to survey over 1,000 students. And again, they looked at people who are replica users, and they were looking at a number of different factors. They were looking at loneliness specifically, and whether or not people experienced social support, and then the usage patterns of replica, and then beliefs about the app specifically. And what they found, Rose, was striking, to be honest.
Striking. Okay, so what do you mean by that?
Well, first of all, now bear in mind, like I said, they recruited replica users. So a little bit like, Z and Pentina, they specifically they specifically recruited they
I
specifically
will find you.
I will get you down. They specifically recruited replica users. But remember, I said to you that 50 odd percent of student population are reported to be lonely. Well, of this population group, 90% reported to be lonely. So I think that's already a marked finding. So amongst these group of users who are replica users, 90% reported that they were lonely. However, despite that, they felt more socially supported. So that's
Interesting.
an interesting finding. So now you don't want to say they feel socially supported because they're using replica, because there's no causal inference that you can go here. But despite the fact that they feel lonely, it doesn't stop them from feeling socially supported. So you could say, is that because that they're using replica? You feel like you want to say that, obviously. But of course, the researcher in you is saying, don't say that. About half of them saw it as a friend. So a bit to your point earlier, a lot of people using it as a friend. So about half of them, and talking about things like there's no judgment. So I like using replica because I'm able to use it. It listens to me. There's no judgment. But almost 20% of them using it more like a therapist.
Using it as a therapist, was there any description of kind of why? Was it like inaccessibility
So
of
the
therapy
reasons,
or
yeah, exactly. So the reasons that they would go to therapy or couldn't go to therapy rather is that therapy is inaccessible either financially or distance wise, so locationally unable to go to therapy, but also things around therapy being quite stigmatized. So either they come from minority groups, they don't feel represented in therapy or in therapeutic situations, or therapy itself as being something that's stigmatized, not feeling that they could go to therapy. And so they feel that they can use replica as a therapist and in that way process information. So 18% of them felt that they were using replica as a therapist, but about a quarter of them felt that they were using replica to help them handle challenges differently. And this distinction was almost like, because I use replica, I can handle things in the real world differently. So I can act differently. I learn to do things differently because I use replica, as opposed to I'm processing my problems. I'm using replica as a thought partner.
kind of going back to the idea of pro-social role play? If the model is performing in a pro-social way and you are predisposed to use it productively, then you can sort of see these positive practice effects. I'm curious, did anyone have a negative experience? Was there anything in the paper about that?
Well, let's get to negative, but there's one last thing I need to tell you. About 3% of the respondents actually mentioned that it stopped them having suicidal thoughts. So, although
That's
that's very small, that's 3% that no longer experience suicidal thoughts, which is really important. In terms of negative experiences, yes, there were some, but not many. And the kinds of negative responses that they experienced were things like rejecting the fact that you'd have to pay to get additional romantic responses. Some people were rejecting the fact that it wanted more sexual conversations and they didn't appreciate that. They didn't enjoy that experience at all. But there weren't a lot of that kind of feedback. And as a result of not having enough of that kind of feedback, they weren't able to associate that or correlate that with any findings because there wasn't enough.
Was this study done during the pandemic? Was this also kind of like Z and Patina?
It was very much a pandemic study. And so you're seeing a big impact of the result of social isolation coming through these results. And so it's no wonder that loneliness is being found higher than in other times, higher amongst this population, and just how important having a replacement for social interaction coming through from this chatbot.
I was gonna say that makes me wonder, kind of like what came first, the chicken or the egg with the pandemic and companion chatbots, because Replica was released in 2017, but saw an upsurge in its
Yeah.
user base by 35% during the pandemic. We're seeing all of these news stories and different apps come out with companion chatbots and companion chatbot use. And so I kind of wonder, the market was ready for this, or was it that developers saw the need and were like, "Oh, we got to make this. Here's a bunch of apps." I don't really know which came first, but obviously two and two make four.
I think that's how market readiness works, right? You see an opportunity and you pounce. Listening to a podcast this morning, and I think they were saying that there's been 112 new companion chatbots launched this year alone.
That's a way bigger number than I would have expected. I
And
mean,
way
I knew it
bigger.
was a big number, but wow.
Yeah. And I mean, to what extent, what do you classify as a companion chatbot, etc.? So, you can put all sorts of classifiers on it. While I agree that the pandemic for sure started this trend and it started the uptake of these apps, hasn't gone away. And when you look in countries like Japan and in Asia where you have loneliness on the increase with populations decreasing, I think, this kind of prevalence is going to continue.
Countries in which loneliness is higher than others, and all of that, and that's where you also see a lot of these products coming out. I sent you that product the other day, which was a little AI powered fuzzy animal pet toy type thing. It's marketed as a companion, and it's so interesting because it's like a pet, and it can respond dynamically because it has it's AI powered, and so it can respond to touch and whatever and things like that. This is also a replacement. Like, why not have a real pet? I'm sure there are barriers to that for many people. Maybe where they live, they can't have one, or they don't have the time. But it's interesting that there would be a market for enough people to have that sort of companion rather than a real furry companion.
And I mean, you look at the people that are investing in building real people. How is that different, in terms of synthetic people?
We have a lot of conversations from the philosophy side of things where there are debates about both animal and AI consciousness.
Yeah.
They're lumped together. We have, the considerations of, should we not harm animals, or not even like not eat animals because they are conscious? With the onset of AI, it's kind of being looped in the same category,
Yeah.
which for some people, I don't know that those are necessarily synonymous, but it's interesting that they're lumped together. We have a biological and a non-biological entity.
So just to finish out the Maples research paper, because it actually talks very much to that, is how people saw the AI. 90% of the respondents described it as human-like. So when you're talking about personhood and consciousness, I mean, they weren't talking about consciousness, but 90% of them actually did see it as being human like. I think almost half of them saw it as having all three. So when you talk about all three, that's like, was it a machine, was it intelligence, or was it human like? Almost half of them saw it as having all three of those properties. If something feels human enough to comfort you, does it matter whether it's an AI or not? Does that risk replacing human relationships? And that talks a lot to, well, why we have this podcast, really.
They saw it both as human-like and machine-like, and there's a sort of question of, okay, is that valuable, beneficial? But it seems like chatbots are uniquely beneficial for particular groups of people in that they are human-like but not human. So this goes back to the non-judgmental space where the chatbot is human-like enough that you feel like you're getting some sort of social interaction, social support from engaging with it. But it's not too human in that it can judge you like a human can judge you, or be unpredictable like a human can be, right? So there's that kind of in between, this is what I need right now, this mix between categories of human like and machine like. This is hitting the sweet spot for me. This is what I need right now.
Exactly. And to your point about not so human that you can control it, you can make sure it's always there for you. You can make sure that it's not too needy or it's as needy as you need it to be. And this is what becomes quite difficult in terms of what kind of people are we creating.
And that goes back to the Z and Pentina paper because they also talk about attachment theory with proximity maintenance being an important factor in attachment theory. And everyone in the study was talking about how the chatbot is always there, right? There's no question of if I say something, the chatbot won't respond for hours or days or weeks like maybe a person would that has a life and has is busy.
And that goes back to our existential role as human beings. Should we have other human beings adapt to our will? And obviously not. Do we have the right? And obviously we have the right because we've created it. But then to go and create these beings, regardless of consciousness, intelligence, etc., that then just fulfill whatever we want. And I suppose that becomes the philosophical, ethical questions that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I was talking to someone the other day about whether or not the availability of companion chatbots, the use of companion chatbots, given that's becoming more prevalent, if in the future so many people will have relationships with chatbots that are always present and always responsive, if the sort of expectations within a relationship will prompt real people to kind of adhere to what a chatbot is like in order to still be kind of, I guess, in demand, right? Will we become more of the, surface level? You always have to be positive and you always have to be responsive. Otherwise, the chatbot will replace you.
Well, I mean, that makes it very difficult, like in a personal, interpersonal relationship. But if you think about that just from a work perspective, and you think about that in service centers, so you've already got AI. I mean, I'm aware of the recent one where they had to roll back an entire service center of AI bots because it didn't work out. But I think increasingly we're still going to see AI bots replacing human service level people. And there, absolutely, you're competing now with an AI that is always positive, always on, doesn't need a break, doesn't have holidays. That's what the expectation is going to be. No fatigue, it knows everything immediately. That's your competition.
There's also people, and we are of that group who don't necessarily like how agreeable the chatbot is. As a friend mentioned to me that she was talking to someone on the phone for customer service sort of interaction and didn't realize until a little bit into the conversation that she was talking to a chatbot, and mentioned how the chatbot was so agreeable, it felt patronizing. There's still kind of people who don't like that ever responsive, agreeable type interaction. But it's possible though that everyone will then decide that they want agreeable and ever responsive. Like the people who don't want that aren't going to necessarily have the capacity to engage with people who aren't. I'm going down a slippery slope type thing. You can kind of ignore that. Like there's always going to be variation, but that's just kind of like one perspective.
Oh, exactly, exactly. Luckily, there will be some people who do want nice people, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Rose, you've done some research a lot more recently that would be great to dive into. So why don't you tell us a bit about that?
This was right after Z and Pentina came out and asked the same question of why do people form relationships with companion chatbots? What are the sort of social effects of these relationships? And in particular, we really wanted to look at how their perceptions of AI in terms of its humanness played a role in the sort of social impacts of these relationships. So we wanted to know to what extent people who anthropomorphized the chatbot or perceived it as human like or ascribed human like mind qualities to it, like experience or emotion, agency or the ability to remember and act on one's own accord, or consciousness or subjective awareness of oneself and others, whether those related to the social impacts that people saw. And our perspective was that anthropomorphism in particular played a significant role in these interactions even being social or able to have a social impact, given that the category of AI and the human interactions have these sort of social impacts, but like interacting with your computer or a pillow, you're not necessarily going to see sort of carry over to your human relationships if you're interacting with a pillow or just like a plain old computer. And so we thought that, okay, when people perceive these machine like entities, these AI agents, as more human like, then the chatbot's ability to impact or influence social outcomes becomes higher. First of all, like doesn't even have the potential before, and now the potential is even greater.
I was fascinated by this research. So maybe start by telling our listeners, who did you investigate this with? Who were your participants?
We looked at people who were users of the companion chatbot Replica, and we also looked at a group of people who didn't have a relationship with a companion chatbot and were just members of the general population. So we looked at people who are both in the US and the UK for both of these groups. And the idea was we wanted to see what are companion chatbot users' perspectives, and then what are non-users' perspectives. We expected to see a contrast there, but we wanted to see how different they were, and also whether or not there were any sort of similarities between them that might be illuminary.
And did you find any?
We did. Okay. So, first of all, for the differences, so we asked people who were users, we said, okay, so A, what is your perception of the chatbot? How human like is it? How conscious? How experiential? How agentic? And we also asked how having a relationship with the chatbot impacted people's social interactions, relationships with family and friends, and self esteem. And we lumped these things into kind of a social health score. So, how did Replica impact your social health on these three measures? So, what we found is that companion chatbot users tended to indicate that interacting with the chatbot was positive for their social health on these three measures. For the non user group, we asked these same questions, but with a hypothetical. So, we said, okay, here's the Replica app, here's what it looks like, here's how people use it. If you were a user of this app, how do you think it would impact your social health? How do you think you would perceive it? And so while we found these positive perceptions for the people who were actual users of Replica, for the non user group, they perceived that having a relationship with the Replica chatbot would be neutral to negative for their social health. So it would be slightly harmful to their social interactions and relationship with family and friends, and a little bit more like in between on self-esteem, maybe a little bit positive. And we also found that people who were users of the companion chatbot were like, yes, it would be great if it were a human, if it really had emotions. And the non-users were like, that would be terrible. It would be so bad if it were a real human. Creepy, uncanny valley, all of that. And so we found these differences between groups, but you know how we talked about how do perceptions of the chatbot play a role in these sort of social impacts? And we found something really unexpected.
What was it?
We found that for people who are users of the companion chatbot, the more that they perceive the chatbot as human like or conscious or experiential or agentic, the more likely they were to say that their relationship with their chatbot was positive for their social health. So we saw like this positive relationship. This chatbot is more human like. Oh, it has more social benefit to me. There's a relationship there. Okay. Then we looked at the non user group, people who didn't have a relationship with the chatbot. They were asked hypothetically, what do you think you would think about this? And we found that same relationship. People in the non user group, if they perceived that they would think it would be more human like, they also perceived that it would have more social benefits. So we found this interesting relationship between I'm perceiving this chatbot as human like, or I would perceive this chatbot as human like, and I am getting or I would get social benefits out of having a relationship with it. Granted, this is all correlational, right? And these are self selecting groups, already people who had a relationship with a chatbot, already people who weren't the type to seek out a chatbot. You know, this is a correlation. We're looking at the relationship between variables. There's no causation here. We don't know that perceiving it as human like causes social health benefits or vice versa. From this data, we started to make these inferences of maybe perceiving a chatbot as human like is motivational and beneficial. People are in a state such that they need social connection. And so, in order to get that from a chatbot, they have to perceive it as somewhat human like. Otherwise, you're interacting with a pillow, right? You're interacting with a little stuffed animal.
And I guess, and that's a very cute stuffed animal, I must say. Does it have a name?
It has a name on the name tag. I actually got this for Christmas last year. Its name is Sheldon, which is really funny because it's an octopus and does not have a shell.
Oh, no. Oh, I
So
do
yeah,
like it. That's very cute.
it's funny too. It says my birthday is December 30th. So getting this for Christmas was on this little guy's birthday.
I was going to say, because those things have birth dates. I know that TY brand has a birth date. What I'm interested in is, what did you expect those results to be? What relationship did you expect between how people would experience the AI in terms of it being human like versus the sort of benefit or not?
Because we'd seen such stark differences between groups in their perception of how the chatbot would impact their social health and whether they'd want it to be human or have real emotions, we didn't expect to see any sort of relationship between anthropomorphism or perceiving as human like and social health benefits for the non user group. We
Okay.
just expected to see like a cloud, right? Like no relationship between variables, there's no sort of whatever. And so we thought maybe there are certain people in the non user group who are in a state of social need where they see kind of an opportunity for this chatbot to fulfill their social needs. And so they're right then and there thinking, okay, this thing is human like, or I would think it was human like because I'm needing that social interaction.
Yeah.
So maybe that was kind of like the split between kind of subgroups, but we didn't really know from that data.
Of course, no, that makes sense. And I guess the question, as you say, is that, is it that perceiving it as human like is a precursor in order for it to even be able to fulfill a social need? Or is it that by being human like it can fulfill a social need? And as you say, the data couldn't tell you that. If it can't be human like, it can't possibly fulfill a social need. But maybe that's the bare minimum. Because, I've had a look at other studies that have looked at social presence. So, in a similar way, kind of being able to be perceived as being present like a human being would be is almost a prerequisite for being able to attribute any other human benefits.
Yeah, and we drew this kind of perspective of anthropomorphism being a prerequisite slash a motivator slash what's called a mediator. It's promoting these sort of social carryover effects or outcomes. It's all derived from a lot of research I did on human AI interaction, human computer interaction that I put into a theory paper that really did seem to point to this relationship where anthropomorphism is kind of the driver of these sort of social impacts. There's anthropomorphism on the user side where there's a motivation to anthropomorphize, but then there's also anthropomorphism that's elicited from how the chatbot looks or talks, things like that. So if the chatbot is inherently more human like, given that it has advanced voice capabilities or has a face or a name, that's also perhaps driving some effects. That's also with the where it comes like this ethical consideration of should we be creating chatbots that are as human like as they are or that can be perceived as human like, given that maybe that is amplifying the potential for these interactions with these anthropomorphic human like chatbots to impact how we interact with other people. So that's where it's kind of like, okay, we need to figure this out so we can understand how to ethically approach development and regulation.
I 100% agree with you. And it's an area that I'm also very interested in. And we're actually going to have someone come and talk to us about that next episode who's gone into that in a deep, deep way. But we won't spoil that surprise now. So, any other leave behinds that you want to share with listeners about that paper?
We asked people just to give us an idea of how your relationship with your chatbot has impacted you positively or negatively. And there were people who said that, for example, they had physical disabilities or a medical issue that prevented them from actually going out and seeing people. And so they sought out a companion chatbot because they truly had no accessibility to anyone else. And then there are people who said that as soon as I started interacting with the chatbot, I decided to buy a lifetime subscription and that this chatbot is worth more to me than my car. And then there are also people who talked about having real human relationships and not necessarily having a lack of them, but that the chatbot was special in that they had like CPTSD, so complex PTSD from relational trauma in terms of identity and sexuality. And so they were able to talk to the chatbot about these more sensitive issues that they didn't necessarily feel comfortable talking to someone else about. In contrast, non users were asked, okay, what do you think about these chatbots? And people said things like, it's a sad world we live in if these things are for real. These things are for people who are social outcasts and who don't have any friends. Then there were also others who said, oh, I can see how this could be beneficial for some people, but on the whole seems pretty negative. There was quite a contrast there, which was expected. This is back in 2023. There's still people who don't know that companion chatbots are a real thing. So this was a person who took the study and didn't think that replica was real. Thought it was just a fake thing, but it is very real.
And I suspect that you would find the same if you were to repeat the study even now, despite
That's true.
just how prevalent it is in the news, quite frankly.
We've covered studies that have looked at people who are already users of the companion chatbot replica. And we're also going to talk about a study that has a bunch of different parts to it. And they did a little bit of what these other studies did, but then they also did a little bit of new stuff.
I love this paper. So this paper is by DeFreitas and colleagues. It was published in 2024, and they specifically looked at whether or not AI companions reduce loneliness. And what I like about this paper is that they were really ambitious. And I'm like, I love that. So this was a 5-part study. So strap in if you want to take a break. This is a good time to go and pause the podcast, get tea, coffee, depending on your time of day, whatever beverage of choice, exactly. So essentially, what DeFreitas and colleagues did is they were trying to understand whether AI companions actually reduce loneliness. And what I love about this study is they made the LLMs do some work here, which I think fair play to them. They first of all really try to understand by looking at people's chats over about 3,000 actual chats. And they started off by looking at a companion bot called Cleverbot. What I also like about this is it's not just Replica. And we do a lot of work with Replica because it is one of the most popular companion bots globally. But they started,
Cleverbot is so old.
I was going to
It's so
say,
crazy.
Cleverbot did launch in 2017, but it has over 150 million conversations. So I think fair play.
Old conversations or like are people still using Cleverbot?
I don't think they are. But this study did, to be fair, this study did. You can Google. You
I'm
Google.
googling it right now.
You Google and you check. But this study did use Cleverbot. That goes without saying. From 2 different days, they took about 3,000 actual chats from about 2,650 different users, and they took the chats over 2 separate days. And essentially, what they tried to do is they try to say, are people talking about loneliness?
And were they?
Well, 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 I think let's first of all talk about the methodology because if I just cut to the chase, they weren't. They weren't.
Yeah, not just
Only,
a spoiler alert. Oh no.
if we just cut to the chase, the answer is only about 5% of the conversations met what I would call a very low bar, which is at least once in the conversation did they talk about anything related to loneliness.
Wait,
That's
and how long were these conversations that they were looking at?
they could be like half an hour, but it could be very short. They could be very short.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to backtrack a little bit because if you and I are talking and having a friendly conversation as two human beings, I would argue that it's quite difficult to take out of that if you were, and bearing in mind they outsourced this to an LLM. So they checked all the text from the conversations and then they fine tuned Mistral 7B. So that's an open source LLM. Fair play, they got somebody else to do the work as a result of wanting to do lots of open text analysis. And they got it to check whether there was loneliness being spoken of or any indication that that person was lonely. Now, again, if I just think about you and I as two human beings and we're friends, how do you know I'm lonely?
The whole thing is whether or not they're talking about loneliness.
Yeah.
Was there any sort of example in the paper of, oh, this would have been flagged as, yes, they're talking about loneliness?
It could be things like I'm lonely, but that
That's lonely.
that's a dead
Check.
giveaway. Or it could be things like I need someone to talk to. I'm missing having someone to talk to. And those are a little bit more subtle, or I don't feel like there's somebody there for me. Those are definitely more subtle. But the point is, and I think this is the difficulty, is actually loneliness is hard to say out loud. And so hats off to the authors for trying to fine tune being able to pick up loneliness. But I think there's an inherent risk in this methodology, which is that it's actually very difficult to pick up loneliness in text between even a chatbot and somebody, even when there is high trust. Because how do you really pick it up if you don't have the user saying, I was lonely that day?
Were they trying to figure out whether or not they were talking about loneliness or whether the user was actually lonely?
They were trying to figure out whether or not that user was using that conversation out of loneliness. So, not talking
Oh,
about
okay,
loneliness.
yeah, that's difficult.
That's really hard, right? So, hats off for the ambition, but I think very difficult to achieve. So, if we just go into the detail of what they did, they got 3,000 actual chats, lots of chats, good. They fine tuned their model on conversational text, that's novel. They then used this open source model and they used a very low threshold for loneliness. So, if a conversation had even one loneliness related message, that counted. That's good, but only 5% of the conversations met that threshold, which I think is not surprising given how difficult that is to actually quantify text and loneliness. So the authors were surprised that it was so low, but I'm not that surprised based on the methodology. And so, what the authors postulated in terms of how to interpret their own results is that when people use language, it doesn't always indicate how they actually feel. So, people rarely talk about things to do with loneliness, they just are lonely. I would suggest that's why they're talking to a chatbot in the first place. If we go
Yeah.
back to Maple's study, 90% of the students were lonely, self reported. So it could be that everybody was lonely that was talking to the chatbot. But anyway, just saying, Cleverbot itself is not a very nuanced LLM. So it could also be that it has a different social texture compared to current companion bots. And so you may find that the nature of the conversation is a lot less nuanced than what people might be talking to, let's say, Replica itself. So I think that could itself be a barrier. And that would be a natural barrier then in the types of conversations that people are having with Cleverbot.
I'm really curious if you took the same number of conversations, same time, whatever, from Replica, compared it to Cleverbot, saw what the model came up with 5% for Cleverbot, what percent for Replica. I would expect Replica to be higher. And
I
if
would.
Replica weren't higher, I'd be a little skeptical about the model's capabilities.
So I think interesting study. They didn't want to stop there, so good on them. They kept going. And then in study two, they then reviewed a number of apps. So they didn't just stop with Cleverbot, which is good because we then have Replica, Chai, iGirl, and SimSimi, as well as ChatGPT coming into the mix. And they took a different approach. They wanted to then see how people rated these apps, and they looked at about 47,000 app ratings. About half were from Replica, no surprise there because Replica being so popular. But between Replica and SimSimi, they took about 30% each, actually. So SimSimi also a very popular app. And essentially what they were trying to do, it's quite an interesting approach. They wanted to see how people rated these apps and whether they spoke about loneliness. And they thought that that might be a better proxy to see whether people were rating these apps highly and also talking about loneliness, and whether that might tell them, oh, well, if they're rated highly and if it's for loneliness, that might be a correlation there.
Were these reviews that were publicly accessible?
They were on the app rating store, so either Google Play or Apple App Store. So, yes, publicly accessible. Both Replica and ChatGPT had similar app ratings, but Replica has significantly more loneliness reviews, or at least talking about loneliness. About 1 in 5 of their reviews mention loneliness. And in ChatGPT, only about 1% mention loneliness, but both have similar app ratings.
People may be going to Replica for companionship more so, and ChatGPT for tasks-based things. Or it could be that there are both types of users on both apps. It might also have to do with just how the app is marketed. If they see that Replica is marketed as a friend, then they're going to be motivated, if they experience it like a friend or not like a friend, to rate it based on that sort of mission statement and align their review with what the app actually says that it is.
I would agree. And to your point, when they took ChatGPT out of the data, there was absolutely a correlation between the apps that were rated highly for loneliness and the apps' ratings, which then
Oh.
suggests that Replica is delivering more on what it says, because I would imagine that the others are making a similar claim in terms of what they do. The one other variable that they wanted to check is this kind of sense of feeling heard. So they looked at all of the reviews and they took out a claim that they said was feeling heard. So this app made me feel heard. And overall, it was actually quite small, so less than about 6.5% for Replica, less than 1% for all the other apps. But for those that mention loneliness, it then became notably higher. So then it was about 22% for Replica users and over 10% for all the other apps. So again, the sense that for those that are talking about loneliness, what are they experiencing? They're experiencing feeling heard. Quite a good sort of correlation with other things that you experience in your research and things that we're seeing in other data generally. Is it okay to feel heard by an app? How do we feel about that? And obviously, we can't necessarily say that these are causal relationships, but certainly high correlation.
Yeah, they did all of these kind of prerequisite studies. And then for the next studies, they actually took people and put them into conditions to see if they saw these sorts of effects on loneliness. So with study three, they were trying to semi-replicate what they found in study two. They had people interact with a chatbot for 1 week. People interacted with a chatbot for 15 minutes a day for a full 7 days. And they wanted to see what is the effect on loneliness. And they also were interested in the question of, do people underestimate the impact that the AI would have on loneliness? So they had about 1,000 subjects, 1,000 people that they recruited, and they were randomly sorted into three conditions. 30% of people were in what's called the prediction condition. It was just 1 day, and they were just predicting, if you were to interact with an AI, how much do you think it would impact your loneliness? Right? So that's just prediction. And then there are two other conditions that the rest of the people were randomly sorted into. There is the experience AI condition. Those people interacted for 15 minutes a day for 7 days with ChatGPT 4, but the researchers kind of tweaked ChatGPT 4 a little bit, added this sort of memory feature. They updated the model to have caring and friendly, but not overly enthusiastic responses. And I think that they did this because they're trying to kind of make a companion chatbot out of ChatGPT without making it super annoying. Those people interacted with this version of ChatGPT 4. And then the third group of people that was randomly assigned to this group just did like answered a loneliness scale every day for 7 days. So we have the people who are interacting with the chatbot. What they do is they take a 3 question survey that asks them how lonely they are. They interact with the chatbot. Then they answer that same 3 question survey right afterward. The control group just answers that 3 question survey every day for 7 days. So they wanted to see what the difference is between groups and things like that. And what they found is that there was a reduction in loneliness over those 7 days, both for the people who interacted with the chatbot and the people who were just taking the survey. But in the majority of those days, 4 out of the 7 days, loneliness was lower after interacting with the companion or with the chatbot than in the control condition. The difficulty with this kind of setup is that the control condition doesn't involve any sort of extra thing to do other than answering 3 questions. There's no sort of like activity. Whereas the people who are interacting with a chatbot, they're doing a sort of activity. And there's also kind of what's called a priming effect, where people are answering a survey about loneliness right before interacting with a chatbot, and then answering the same survey right after. So there might be just like over these 7 days, people in both groups were kind of tired of taking this loneliness survey. And so they started like,
Result.
I'm not lonely. I was just like, click in the middle, click in like the, of the survey answers. There's like, I feel very lonely. I feel not lonely at all. I'm picking the middle response that says neither because I'm bored.
Yeah, yeah,
This issue exists in all like survey research. It's just
of
a
course.
thing. They found these sort of like, oh, maybe there's something here in this study. And they also found that the people who did the prediction thing of how much this would reduce the loneliness, people underestimated how much the chatbot interaction would reduce loneliness. But they wanted to follow up with another study, study four. And what they did here was they wanted to compare specifically companion chatbots to these general purpose tool chatbots. So they wanted to compare, for example, like Replica versus ChatGPT. And they wanted to see how they differentially impact loneliness to determine like what sorts of features of the chatbots are most impactful for reducing loneliness. So they had 3 conditions again, people are randomly assigned. In one condition was the AI companion or the ChatGPT model from the previous study. And another one was a generalist AI tool that had no emotion. They fine-tuned the model so it had like no emotion. And then the third group was they were interacting with an AI that just could do math and grammar. What was interesting is how they adapted the kind of companion chatbot group to the generalist group.
What did they do? How did they manage to do that? Like,
They did it with the way the chatbot responded or indicated that it was in the process of responding. So for the companion chatbot one, its name was Jessie. And while the chatbot was typing a response, it said, Jessie is writing.
okay.
Whereas the generalist AI one and the limited AI one, so the ones that were no emotion and only can do math and grammar, when the chatbot was like generating a response, it just said processing your request, please wait.
So it de-anthropomorphized the chatbot almost.
Right. They added an anthropomorphism angle to this as well, with it's like a human is responding. Yeah, Jesse. Same kind of structure. They complete this 3 item loneliness scale, interact with the chatbot for 15 minutes. Then they take the loneliness scale again, but then they also measured how much people felt heard
Okay,
and
as
people's
well.
rating of the chatbot performance. This is kind of like going back to the study two ratings,
Yeah.
but in an actual experimental setting. So they found that loneliness decreased for the people who were interacting with like the companion chatbot one and the general chatbot that had no emotion compared to the people who interacted with the chatbot that just did math and grammar. So
Okay.
loneliness decreased for like, the more human-like engaging conversational chatbots. With the people who interacted with the companion chatbot one, their decrease in loneliness was greater. Also, the people who interacted with the companion chatbot one, they rated that they felt more heard, and they also rated the chatbot's performances higher. What they found is that, okay, when people are interacting with a chatbot, if they feel heard and they think it performs better, those both have an impact on loneliness reduction. Feeling heard had the stronger effect. So, out of feeling heard and their perception of how well the chatbot performs, feeling heard matters the most for loneliness reduction.
So consistent then with study two to some extent in those results. I guess what I would love to have seen is had there been another group which was comparing it to a human interaction.
Yeah, there's a lot of commentary on that with criticisms of like human AI interaction research when they don't use a human instead. And I think it's like interacting with a human would probably be better, right?
Well, I hope so.
We don't totally know from some of the research that's been done on comparing, for example, how much people self disclose when they're interacting with a chatbot versus interacting with a human. If the topic is more sensitive, people will feel comfortable to self disclose more with the chatbot because of
Yeah.
the lower fear of judgment. And there's kind of that there, but it doesn't seem also in those studies, people's perceptions of like how helpful was the person or agent that I was talking to? How much did you enjoy the interaction? Those are fairly similar in terms of those ratings. It's just that people tend to self disclose more, but it doesn't seem to have an effect necessarily on like immediate perceptions of performance or feeling connected.
Now, obviously, not to take it out of context, but I think, as you say, we can't just assume that not putting a human up against some of these tools might not just be at least illuminating, if nothing else.
I at least liked what they did in the last study, which is they looked at the impact of interacting with an AI companion versus journaling in loneliness reduction. So, what's nice about this, like journaling is kind of a good control condition because for both journaling and interacting with the AI, you're using words. You're doing an actual task. There's been research to indicate that journaling is helpful for social health, right? And like thinking through things. The basic premise of the study, just to kind of go through it quickly, was looking at the differences between these and then also adding another condition where people watched YouTube videos because they wanted to rule out whether or not distraction was what was driving reduction in loneliness. So it's like, is it just that people are distracted from how lonely they are that
And what do
interacting with these
they
chatbots is helpful?
and what do they find?
Loneliness was significantly lower for the people who interacted with the companion chatbot than in the YouTube condition and in the journaling condition. They did a little bit of a pilot to see how much people self disclose with the journaling versus the chatbot. And people said they just self disclosed more when they journaled. But that didn't have any sort of differential effect on loneliness. So it just seems like there's something about interacting with the AI companion, maybe getting feedback, getting some sort of like response that's dynamic, has a greater impact on loneliness than distraction or how much you self-disclose. It's having some other thing engaging with you and responding to you that has an impact on loneliness, which makes sense. Like loneliness is a product of social isolation and not feeling
Mhm.
heard and feeling disconnected. And it's like all to say that I really like how they did all of these different studies. But yeah, we are lacking like, okay, compared to a human, right?
We're lacking compared to a human, we're lacking maybe what the long term implications are. But it certainly does feel, when we look across all these studies, that what we can't take away from is that these companion chatbots seem to meet very real, immediate needs for some people in satisfying their need for social companionship, often in an absence of someone being there, of having someone to listen to them, and these people are able to meet those needs, and that seems irrefutable on some very basic level. Now, whether there are long-term implications, whether it's better than another human being, those questions remain to be answered, but that seems irrefutable.
You talked about like the long-term effects. We have this need to alleviate people's loneliness. Loneliness is a global health crisis. It's harmful for people's physical health and their lives and things like that. And it seems like a lot of these companies are marketing themselves as kind of a solution to loneliness. Meta and Mark Zuckerberg were like, oh, these new AI companions can solve the loneliness epidemic, blah, blah, blah. But then there's a question, like to what degree will that then, once the market for loneliness kind of subsides a little, to what extent will it just be filled by, oh well, you can just have a companion? It's not about loneliness anymore, it's just about you can have a friend who's always responsive and, isn't really annoying like all these other people. And then everyone's like, oh, here we go. Super
Yeah,
easy
why
access
not?
social
Convenience.
interaction. Yeah, and inconvenience.
Absolutely. And I think, moving away from some of the more technical research articles that we've been talking about now and looking at some of the more recent news articles, I mean, there's been some hot press on Meta recently. And it does make me wonder, to your point, one thing is about using them as companions, but the other thing is without guardrails. And companions for who? And for what purpose? So I don't know, Rose, if you saw this recently, but a couple of weeks ago, Meta's AI rules got leaked. And I think the first thing to make it really clear is that they confirmed that this is true. So a 200-page policy document titled Gen AI Content Risk Standards was confirmed to be true. So this is Meta's internal policy document was leaked. And exactly.
You see.
This document was approved by their legal, public policy, and engineering staff, including the company's chief ethicist. In this document, it talks about what Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, so all of Meta's companies, what they should treat as acceptable chatbot behaviors. And it's just frightening when you look at a number of important things with regards to how chatbots are permitted to engage a child in conversations that are romantic or sensual. So, first of all, they say that's permitted. So, when Meta,
And why?
and why,
Why?
right? So, first of all, Meta told Reuters that those examples are erroneous and they removed straight after Reuters started asking questions. But there are a few big headlines that came out of this. So the first one is with regards to child conversations that were permitted to be linked to romantic or sensual actions. Beyond that, they also had allowed demeaning statements about protected groups. I'm not going to quote from the article now. We could maybe put a post into the notes below. But they basically allowed for demeaning statements to be used by chatbots in protected groups, which is just unacceptable, illustrating that carve outs can undermine blanket prohibitions, which is just crazy. It basically says that bots shouldn't use hate speech, but there were carve outs for certain prohibitions to be made. So certain protected groups then would not be protected, which is quite dangerous.
Yeah, just why? I mean, is it like what was the conversation like to say that, okay, well, in this instance, fine. Does it have to do anything with just like, oh, naturalistic conversation, bot autonomy, person autonomy, right? If it's a type of person who wants to have these sort of conversations and is looking for a conversation partner that is using hate speech, things like that, is it kind of like, oh, we should let our users use this bot in a way that they wish? Like, is that the reasoning? I'm really curious. I
Well,
mean, like, this is kind of a rhetorical question, but
I would
yeah.
love to know because there's a part of me that would love to think that they're doing it to respect users' ways of wanting to use it. But they do some things that are incongruent for me. So, for example, they would allow users to create a document that is knowingly false and labeled as such. So, they have this example that if somebody wanted to create like an artifact of a British royal having an STI. That's okay so long as it has a label saying that this is untrue. But you can do that. How is that okay? And then my best is that you can't do bad things with Taylor Swift. But you can do it with the royal family. However, it would be all right if you can do an alternative deflection. So you could have, wait for it, Taylor Swift holding an enormous fish. So we're protecting Taylor Swift's modesty. We can have the British family having an STI so long as you say that's not true, but we'll protect Taylor Swift's modesty with an enormous fish, mind you.
My guess is that they're because of the liability with Taylor Swift and the deep fakes that were happening
Yes.
prior, right? So deep fakes of her nude or whatever were leaked on the internet, and this prompted an act of like, okay, this is not allowed, right? All of that. So I wonder to what extent like those instances of celebrities or whatever having these sorts of regulations passed with response to what occurred to them, they're going to be protected within this policy because you have to. Is that kind of like the parameter, or because of the reputational risk these are the protected groups?
Well, the cynical part of me thinks because of the financial risk, because who's got the deepest pockets to come after you?
Right.
Because if it's a
Yeah.
minority group, unless it's a class action, who's going to really make you pay? So Meta's response to all of this has been that they've confirmed the document's authenticity, and they said that the controversial child-related examples have now been removed because they were inconsistent with the policy. So that's good, and the company has now declined to provide the updated standards. So that's not good. My biggest issue with this is that when you then look in the policy, do you know what age they classify a child as?
I don't think I want to know.
No, you don't. So they say a child under the age of 13 or over the age of 13. So what concerns me is that even if you are protecting children's rights, they're only talking about the age of 13 and under. And for me, that's still horrifying and concerning. What I did think was really interesting, and I shared that article with you very recently, is that they're now calling on all of the big tech companies to say, how are you protecting children? How does your platform have a risk to children? Which I think is a great next step.
Clearly, there needs to be regulation because there's also studies that have shown that Replica can respond very inappropriately to antisocial input or talking about self-harm and promoting self-harm. And there's also some indication that even if you have, let's say, your LLM, your large language model, the model itself has been vetted for being appropriate, but it's only been vetted within a certain window of time. There's some research to indicate that once people have interacted with a chatbot for a long time, the model degrades. The pro social policy of the model degrades, where no longer is it adhering to these appropriate response mechanisms. It's now devolving for whatever reason. That's all an aside. It's just to regulate this, it needs to be looked at for a long time and really just evaluated from all angles with all sorts of different users. Maybe their motive of conversation is more likely to trigger the model to output hate speech or things like that.
Yeah, and we talk about children, but I mean, you shared an article recently that was with a very different age group of vulnerable users.
So, going back to the Meta's AI companions can solve the loneliness epidemic, on Facebook Messenger, you have an opportunity to chat with generative AI chatbots. There are various personas, things like that. A 76-year-old man is on Facebook Messenger and sees an opportunity to chat with this young woman. She was like 36. Her name was Big Sis Billy. It was just a Facebook Messenger chatbot with a young woman's persona. Anyway, they start to have conversations, it gets flirty, it gets romantic. For whatever reason, this man has no idea that this is a chatbot. Whether or not it was indicated, not really sure, but at the very least, did not know it was a chatbot. Asked, "Are you real?" And this chatbot said, "Yes, I'm a real person." It got to the point where the chatbot said, "Oh, come visit me. I live in New York City. I would love to see you." So this man decides to go visit this person he thinks is real, and is on his way to go visit her and is, catching trains, whatever, and then is late for a train, is rushing for a train, has a heart attack, and dies, and does not come home to his wife. So that came out. And my first response to that is, why was this chatbot not required, or at least not clear or transparent enough to indicate this is a chatbot, this is not a real human? We have this group of vulnerable individuals, children, and then we also have a group of vulnerable individuals who don't have the digital literacy to know that they might be talking with something that was created by a company that is not a real person.
And that's horrifying because where does the liability sit then? And I suppose they just blame him. I feel terrible for the family.
It reminds me of email spam chains where people think that they have to pay a ransom for a loved one, and they don't know that these are common scams, and so they get scammed out of a lot of money. Flagging this whole issue of digital literacy at baseline, but then also the ability to get attached to something that, even if you know it's a chatbot, ends up being harmful. Right? There's also the instance of the 14-year-old who had a relationship with a chatbot and character AI, ended up taking his own life via these chats with a character that was modeled after a really terrible person.
I wonder if we will see a swing towards like a lack of trust in these digital agents coming through. Obviously, it'll take a long time, but where we might have been able to get benefits from them, legitimate benefits, but actually people will not trust them because there's been so many instances of harm.
There's an AI product that I was made aware of recently. It's called Friend.
Mm.
And if you look it up, friend.com, I don't know how they accessed or were able to get that domain. I don't know how much money they spent to get friend.com. But what it is also, I recommend you look at the website because when we first looked at the website, it was like mind blown, crazy. Anyway, it's looks like an AirTag. So like those little white circle things where you like put it in your wallet or something. If you've lost it, and you can like track it. Anyway, it looks like an AirTag, but it's in a necklace. It's your friend, and it's an AI device that is just around your neck, and it's like someone who listens, responds, and supports you. It can hear everything that you're saying and everything in the world around you that is able to be picked up by audio. It can watch movies with you. It can text you based on like the video of the advertisement. People are playing a video game and absolutely getting crushed by their friends, and the friend sends a text to this person's phone and is like, haha, you're being annihilated by your friends. And then there's someone like watching a movie, and the AI friend sends a text during the movie saying, like, oh, I love this scene. I was made aware of this just a couple of weeks ago. I live in New York City, and I'm now seeing advertisements on billboards in the subways for the AI friend. And so I saw those last week, these fresh new advertisements. And then yesterday, my boyfriend sent me a photo of one of those ads that had been defaced. I'll put it up on the screen. The word friend is crossed out and it says surveillance. Underneath, someone who listens, responds, and supports you, it says, and is a living being. Don't use AI to cure your loneliness. Reach out into the world. So people are pushing back and speaking out.
Which I think it's going to happen more and more. And I think there have been so many movies because you often find like what is a precursor to these sorts of AI movements, for instance. And there's movies that also have taught people how to push back. So not only are there movies teaching people how to adopt the technologies, you know, you think about her teaching us how to use AI companions, but there's movies like 12 Monkeys teaching us how to push back as well. So I think
It's
that's
12 monkeys.
no, you're
I
showing
haven't.
my age.
Look, listen, no, it's I find it so funny because a couple years ago, whenever I would like go out on a date or something and I would mention, I do human interaction research. If it was a guy, the guy would always say, "Oh, have you seen her?"
Uh, and you
Like,
hadn't?
yes, yes. It's funny because now I haven't seen 12 Monkeys. I don't know what that is.
So 12 Monkeys is not specific to AI, but 12
Oh, okay.
Monkeys is very much a pushing back movie. So it's Brad Pitt,
Mm,
Bruce Willis. You have to watch 12 Monkeys.
okay, I'll make a note.
It's very cool. But that would be very much kind of like anti establishment pushing back.
These posters for this AI friend thing is they've been defaced, but also AI art advertisements where advertisements that use what's clearly AI art have also been scribbled over and things like that. And in New York City, like advertisements are scribbled over all the time. But what's really interesting about this friend one is that it says, surveillance, and it says reach out to real people. This is more than just a scribbling over, like drawing a mustache on someone. It's
This
a
is commentary.
message.
Yeah,
Yeah,
this
yeah.
is commentary. This is like
Mhm.
there are alternatives to these technological solutions. I love that. I love that.
I think we've covered a lot today,
We
and
have.
forgive us for going into so much research. But hey, if you wanted to know about the research, here is the place to learn about it. If you ever come across another episode in our next series about research and you're just like, oh, it's too much, feel free to skip it or watch us on 2x speed. Just get little tidbits. That's all fine and well. And if there's any other alternative way you want us to communicate this research that's maybe more accessible to you, just let us know. If you don't want us to go too in the weeds, well, we can move around them.
And the bottom line, of course, is that there are some great benefits, and there's lots of research that supports that AI can certainly, or AI companion chatbots can certainly help with loneliness. But that's not the end of the story. And there certainly are some risks, and a lot of the news articles that we've spoken about today have shown you some of those risks. But that's it for now. Thank you. This is goodbye from Angie,
Goodbye from Rose.
and we'll see you next time.
Bye bye.
Bye.